The strike order had been given twice, and the old dragon had not moved. Yusen Olari Kalu stood with his back against Mere's lower jaw and his palms flat to the warm ridged scale. And he watched the wing captain walk 3 steps closer through the wet grass of the upper moor and stop, because Mere's eye, which was the size of a serving plate and the color of a banked forge, had come down low and had fixed on the wing captain's chest and had not blinked. The handler child did not speak. Handler children were not given a voice in a strike yard. Handler children were the small, thin people who slept in the dragon stalls with their hands on the lower scale of an animal 300 years older than them, and who came when called, and who lifted when the wing said lift. The lift had been called. The lift had been refused. The wing captain's mouth was a hard, flat line under the bone gray of his service helm, and his glove was on the butt of his short stave, and behind him, on the lower terrace of the launch yard, the 7 other dragons of the Lenra wing were squared on their pads and were waiting for the older one to go first, because the older one always went first, and the older one, today, was not going. "Handler," the wing captain said. His voice was the careful voice an officer used when he was trying not to break a thing he could still salvage. "Step aside." Yusen did not step aside. He had been bonded to Mere for 9 winters, since the spring after his mother had left him at the salt gate of the Halson service, with a thumbprint on his shoulder and a small wooden tag at his throat that said her name and his and nothing else. And in those 9 winters he had learned exactly one rule about a dragon who would not lift, which was that you did not step away from her. You stayed where she could see you. You kept your hands on her. You did not give the wing a clean line to her eye. He kept his hands on her. He did not give the wing a clean line. The wing captain's glove tightened on the short stave. "Handler Olari," the wing captain said. "I will not ask a 3rd time." "Sir," Yusen said. His voice came out small. He was 14 winters old. He was a head shorter than the wing captain's elbow. He had not eaten since the dawn meal, because handler children did not eat before a launch, in case the launch went bad and the stall had to be opened in a hurry. His tongue felt thick. He said the sentence anyway, because he had been turning it over in his mouth since the 2nd order, and he had nothing else. "She won't lift, sir. She knows what's in the valley." The wing captain's eyes narrowed. "What's in the valley," he said, "is a column. An Austrian column, which we have been ordered to interdict." "Yes, sir." "Then she will lift." "She knows it isn't a column, sir." The wet wind came across the upper moor from the north, and it moved the long heather, and the 7 other dragons on their pads shifted, very slightly, in the small, careful way dragons shifted when they were listening. Mere did not shift. Mira's eye stayed on the wing captain's chest. Yusen felt her lower jaw warm against the back of his head, and he felt, through his palms, the slow, steady drum that was the 2nd of her 3 hearts, which was the heart she used when she was waiting to see if a thing would be taken from her or given to her. And he kept his hands flat and warm against the scale and did not move. "Handler," the wing captain said, "step aside, or I will have you." Stepped aside. Behind the wing captain, the 2nd of the launch wardens had begun, slowly, to walk forward. The launch warden was a heavy man in a long brown coat who carried a hook staff in his right hand and a coil of stall rope in his left. And the hook staff was the thing they used on a dragon who would not lift when the handler had failed. Yusen had seen the hook staff used twice in his 9 winters. Once on a hatchling who had panicked at a thunderstrike. Once on a middle-aged drake who had been hit in the inner ear by shrapnel and had stopped knowing the lift call. Both times the dragon had screamed. Both times the dragon had lifted. Both times the handler had been sent back to the stall and had not been a handler again for a long count. He did not want the hook staff on Mira. Mira was 340 winters old. Mire's bones, under the warm-ridged armor of her flank, were the slow, careful bones of a creature who had carried the 2nd Halson wing through the long war of his grandfather's grandfather's time, and who had lifted, without refusing, for every wing captain her people had given her since, and who had earned, in those 300 winters, the small private right that the older dragons earned, which was the right to be listened to when she said no. She had said no twice now. The wing captain had heard her say no twice. The wing captain was bringing the hook staff. Yusen looked at the wing captain. He looked at the launch warden. He looked, past both of them, at the lower edge of the upper moor, where the long fall of the ground ran down into the valley of the Lenra, and the river ran small and silver between the two reed beds, and the early morning fog had not yet quite lifted off the water. He could not see the column from the upper moor. The strike sites in the wing house could see it. The 7 other dragons could feel it. Mira could feel it. Mira had been feeling it for the better part of an hour, and her lower jaw had been growing slowly warmer under his palms, and her second heart had been drumming a little harder, and she had begun, in the small, careful way of an old creature trying to tell a young one, a thing the young one already half knew, to make the low, warm sound that the old dragons made when they were grieving in advance. He had heard the sound before. He had heard it once. He had heard it on the morning the third stall mother had been told that her unhatched egg had cracked in the night, and she had been called to lift the dead shell out of the stall, and she had made the low, warm sound for the better part of a watch before she had lifted the shell. He had not understood the sound then. He had been small. He understood it now. "Sir," he said. He did not take his hands off Mira. He turned his head, only, to look at the wing captain. "Sir. Please. The strike sites, sir. Please. The strike sites are wrong. It isn't a column. The strike sites," the wing captain said, "are the strike sites of the Halcyon service. They are not wrong. Mire knows, sir. Mare is an animal. Mara is the older animal of the Lenra wing, sir." Yusen heard his own voice. It came out steadier than he expected. He had not known, until that sentence, that the steadier voice was in him. "Sir. She has lifted for the Halcyon service for 340 winters. She has never refused a lift in 340 winters. If she is refusing this one, sir, she knows." The wing captain looked at him. The wing captain was a hard man, but he was not a stupid man. And Yusen saw, in the small flicker of the wing captain's mouth, the moment that the sentence landed. It landed. It did not stay. The wing captain's glove did not come off the short stave. The launch warden did not stop walking. "Handler," the wing captain said. "Stand. Aside." "Sir," Yusen said. "I can't." The wing captain breathed out, once, slow. He gave the small nod that was the nod that called the hook staff. The launch warden lifted the hook staff to a carry grip. Yusen kept his hands on Mire. And then, because Mire had been 340 winters in the service of the Halcyon and had learned, in those winters, exactly when an old dragon's lower jaw was the only thing between a young handler child and a hook staff, she did the thing that no one in the upper yard had ever seen an old dragon do for a handler child. She moved her lower jaw, very slowly, in a half-arc over Yusen's small body. And she closed the inside curve of her jaw around him. Not biting. Not lifting, only sheltering the way an old dam covered a small kit in a high wind. And she held him there. In the warm, dark wet of her inner cheek, with the warmth of her second heart drumming through the bone of her jaw against his back, and the soft, slow breath of her lung moving against his hair. And she lifted her eye, again, to the wing captain, and she made the low, warm, grieving sound, very softly. Once. The way one says the name of a thing one does not want to lose. The launch warden stopped walking. The wing captain stopped breathing for a count. Yusen could not see the wing captain anymore, because the inside of Merez's lower jaw was the only world he could see. But he heard the wing captain's bootsteps stop on the wet stone of the upper yard, and he heard, very faintly, the small breath-in of 7 other dragons, on 7 other pads behind him, as they understood, all at once, what the older one had done. In the small, dark warm of the inner cheek, Yusin put his hands flat against the slow, soft pink of Mira's gum. And he breathed. And he did not cry. He had not cried since he was 9. He did not cry now. He pressed his hands against the warm gum, and he felt the long, slow drum of the second heart, and he said, very softly, into the dark, warm, in the small handler tongue that was the small handful of words a handler child and an old dragon shared with no one else. I am here. I am here. I am here. The lower jaw warmed against him. The lower jaw did not open. Outside the lower jaw, the wing captain stood for a long count. Then the wing captain said the small word, that was the word he used to call the wing back from a launch. The word was given quietly, but the 7 other dragons heard it. And the 7 other dragons, in the long, slow, careful unison of a wing that knew how to obey, lowered their heads, very slightly, off the lift posture, and folded their wings, and stood down. The launch warden lowered the hook staff. The wing captain did not speak again. 1111. 11111. The wing captain turned, and he walked, alone, off the upper yard, and down the lower stair, toward the wing house. The launch warden, after a moment, lowered his head, and followed. Yusin stayed in the warm, dark wet of Mira's lower jaw for a long count after the bootsteps had gone. He stayed because Mira did not open the jaw. He stayed because he understood. In the small, slow way understanding, came to a 14-winter handler child, that the lower jaw was not, just then, a shelter from the hook staff. The lower jaw was a shelter from what was coming, because the wing captain was a hard man, but he was not a stupid man, and a hard man who had been refused twice by an older animal he respected would not go to the wing house to forget the morning. The wing captain would go to the wing house to file the morning, and the filing of the morning would, by the second bell, be on the lower table of the high stall master, and the high stall master, who had no patience for handler children who put their hands between a wing captain and a strike order, would call for Yusen, and for Mire, and there would be the small, careful procedure that the Halson service had for a handler and dragon pair who had refused a lift. Yusen had read the procedure once, in the small book of orders that hung in the stallmaster's office on a brass chain. He had been 12. He had been curious. He had read the page. He had not slept that night, and he had not, for a long time, asked any further questions of the small book. The procedure was separation. The older one, the dragon, was to be moved to a holding stall in the lower yard. The handler was to be returned to the long house. A new handler, usually an older one, a 3rd winter or 4th winter senior, was to be brought up, and a rebinding rite was to be attempted. And if the rebinding took, the dragon was to be lifted, alone, by the new handler. And the old handler was to be sent down to the kitchen yard for reassignment. If the rebinding did not take, if the older one refused the new hand, which the older ones almost always did, because old dragons did not give the small private right of their lower jaw to a stranger after 300 winters of giving it to one small thin person, then the older one was to be retired. The word in the small book was retired. Yusen had asked Mira's old second handler what the word meant when the small book used it, and the old second handler had looked at him a long count and had said, "It means they take her out into the lower marsh, and they put a long heavy ring on her neck, and they walk her out as far as the lower marsh runs. And they leave her there. And she does not come back. Old dragons do not come back from the lower marsh. The lower marsh is the place the Halson service sends the dragons it has finished with." Yusen had not slept that night either. He pressed his hands against the warm gum. The lower jaw stayed closed. In the small dark wet of the inner cheek, he made a decision that, in the long telling of the upper yard story by his great-grandchildren, would later be called the small decision that a small, thin handler child made on the upper moor of Lenra on the morning that an old dragon refused to strike. The small decision was not, in the moment, large. It was only the decision a small, thin handler child made, when the small, thin handler child understood. With the slow, careful clarity of 14 winters, that did not feel like 14 winters anymore. That the lower marsh was not, today, a place anyone was going to walk an old dragon out into. He pressed his palms harder against the warm gum. He said, in the handler tongue, into the dark, open. The lower jaw opened. The warm, wet air gave way to the cool wet of the upper moor. Yusin stepped out into the gray morning light. He stood under Miray's lower jaw. He looked up at her eye. Rope. Her eye held his. Her eye blinked, once. In the slow way her people blinked, when they were paying attention to a thing they were about to be asked to do. Old friend, Yusen said. His voice was small. His voice was steady. We have to go. We have to go. Miray's lower jaw warmed. Not into the valley, Yusen said. Not back to the stall. We have to go, old friend. Away. The lower jaw warmed again. The second heart drummed. The eye held him for a long count. Then, the eye blinked. Very slow. Twice, in the gesture the old handler tongue used for yes. Yusen stepped back. He stepped clear of her lower jaw. He looked at the 7 other dragons on the lower pads, and the 7 other dragons looked back at him, and he understood, in the small, slow way, that the 7 other dragons had also heard the wing captain's quiet word, and were, in the long, slow, careful way of a wing that knew the small book, already aware of what was coming next. The lower jaw of the second oldest, a deep brown drake named Voss, lifted, very slightly. It was the small gesture the wing used for go. Yusen put his foot on the lower scale of Miray's foreleg. He climbed, in the small, practiced way, a handler child climbed an older one, up the lower scale, and onto the long, warm ridge of the shoulder, and into the worn leather of the lower saddle, which was the saddle the handler children rode in, between the wing saddle and the long ridge of the spine. He buckled the lower strap. He took the small handler rein in his small, thin hands. He bent forward and pressed his forehead to the warm scale of the shoulder. Old friend, he said. Lift. Mira lifted. She did not lift the way a war dragon lifted to a strike call. She lifted the way an old creature lifted when the small, thin person on her back had finally asked her, after a long count, for the one thing she had been waiting all morning to give. She lifted slow and careful and without the long wing stretch of the lift call. Only the small, careful gather of the lower haunches and the long, slow push, and the upper yard fell away under them, and the 7 other dragons on the 7 other pads did not move. And the wing captain, who had paused at the lower step of the wing house and turned, did not call out, and the launch warden did not lift the hook staff. And the morning fog of the Lenra Valley came up under them as Mara turned, slow and high, in the gray air, away from the valley, and away from the column, and away from the lower marsh, and toward the long north line of the upper moors, where the heather went on for 4 days' fly, and where the small, thin people on the small dragons had not been seen in 3 generations. In the small saddle on the warm shoulder, Yusen pressed his cheek to the scale and closed his eyes for a count. And the second heart drummed under his cheek, and the cool, wet air of the upper moor moved through his thin hair, and a 14-winter handler child who had not, that morning, eaten anything, and who had refused a wing captain in the open yard, and who had stepped between an old dragon and a hook staff, breathed out, once, slow, and felt, in the small, careful way the older ones felt things, the warmth of a thing he had known about himself since he was 9 but had not, until that morning, said out loud, even to himself. He had not signed the lift call. He had not been ordered to refuse it. He had refused it for her. She had refused it for him. Between the two of them, in the long, careful arc of 9 winters, they had refused the only order the Halson service had ever given them, that they could not, in the small, dark place behind the second heart, carry. The lift was not the lift. The lift was the burning of a column that the strike sites had called a column, and that an old dragon had known. In the slow, careful way her people knew the things her people knew, was not a column. Mirai had felt it on the air. Mirai had felt it on the underlight of the river. Mirai had felt it in the small, frightened gather of small lungs. the way an older one felt the small, frightened gather of small lungs. And Mireille had known, with the certainty her people gave to the certainty of small lungs, that the thing in the valley was not what the wing captain had been told it was. The thing in the valley was a refugee line. Yusen had known it too. He had not said so to the wing captain. He had not, in the moment under the lower jaw, had the words. He knew it because 2 mornings before, in the lower mess where the handler children ate, the winghouse cook had set down a tray of bread and had said, in the small, low voice the cooks used when they were saying a thing they were not supposed to be saying, that the Austrian hold had broken on the eastern reach, and the families of the lower farms were on the road, and the road came down through the Lenra Valley. Yusen had not thought, at the time, that the road came down through the valley they were assigned to interdict. He had not made the connection. He was 14. He did not make the connections the wing captain was paid to make. Mireille had made the connection. Mireille had made the connection on the air, in the careful way an older one made connections, the way she had once known, when Yusen was 9, that the small kit in the 4th row stall was running a fever before the fever keeper had come. The way she had known, when Yusen was 11, that the upper rafter of the longhouse was rotting through and would fall before the next snow, and had refused, for 3 days, to be quartered under it. Mireille knew small lungs. Mireille had felt the small lungs in the valley fog. Mireille had refused the lift. Yusen pressed his cheek to the warm scale of the shoulder. He breathed. He understood, in the cool wet air of the high lift, that the thing he had done in the upper yard was a thing that would be filed, by the second bell, in the small book of the high stallmaster, and that the small book had no page for it, and that the page that would be opened for it would be a page that ended in the lower marsh. He understood that he would not go to the lower marsh. He pressed his small thin hand to the warm ridge of Mireille's shoulder. He turned his face into the slow, steady wind. He did not weep. He had not wept in 5 winters. He did not weep now. He looked, instead, north, into the long fall of the heather, and he thought about the things he had heard, in the small, low voice of the winghouse cook, about the upper country beyond the heather. The upper country was a country the Halcyon Service did not patrol. The upper country was a country where the small, thin people on the small dragons had once lived, before the long war of his grandfather's grandfather's time, and where the small old shrines of the dragon binders had been built, and where, the cook had said one evening when he was very drunk, a handler child and an old dragon, if they could fly 4 days into the heather, would not, in any practical sense of the Halcyon Service, be findable. The cook had said it as if he were saying a thing he had once thought about when he was younger and had not done. Yusen thought about the cook for a long count. Then he thought about Mara. Then he leaned forward and pressed his forehead to the warm scale of the shoulder. And he said, into the cool, wet air, in the handler tongue, the small word that meant the thing it meant, north. Mara's wing beat changed. The long, slow, careful push of the upper moor lift turned, very slightly, in the high air, the way a thing turned when it had been asked to go a longer way than it had been planning to. The 7 other dragons of the Lenra wing fell away under them, small now, on the upper yard. The lower marsh was behind them. The Lenra Valley was a small silver thread to their right. The long north line of the upper moors opened ahead. Mira, in the small, slow, careful way her people did the small, slow, careful things, lifted her long, warm, scaled neck into the cool, wet wind, and pushed. And the upper moor of Lenra fell away under them, and the morning fog gave way to the cleaner upper air. And Yusen, in the small, lower saddle, did not look back. He kept his cheek on the warm scale of the shoulder for a long count, and the second heart drummed under his cheek, and the cool, wet wind moved through his thin hair. And after a long enough while that the upper yard of Lenra was a small gray scratch on the horizon, and the 7 small shapes on the 7 pads were no longer separable from the scratch, and the wing house, and the lower stair, and the long house, and the kitchen yard, and the small book on the brass chain, were no longer, in any practical sense, the world he was in. He sat up, slowly, in the lower saddle. And he opened his eyes. And he looked at the long, quiet country opening ahead of them. And he understood. In the small, slow way understanding came to a 14-winter handler child that he had just done a thing that, in the long telling of his life, would never quite stop being the most important thing he had ever done. He had refused. Mira had refused. The wing had stood down. The 7 other dragons had let them go. The upper moor was behind them. The lower marsh, for now, was behind them. The long north country was ahead. He did not know if they would be followed. He did not know if the wing captain, when he had finished the filing, would call a second wing up out of the eastern yard and send it after them. He did not know what the high stall master would do. He did not know whether the Halson service had, in its small, careful book, a page for the long, quiet pursuit of a 14-winter handler child and a 340-winter dragon who had refused a lift and had flown north. He did not know any of those things. He knew, only, that Mira's second heart was still drumming, slow and steady, under his cheek, and that the long, warm wing beat under him was the wing beat of an old creature who had been carrying small, thin people for 340 winters, and had not, in those winters, dropped a single one of them. He knew that the cool, wet wind of the upper moor was clean. He knew that the fog of the Lenra Valley, with its small, frightened lungs in it, was no longer on his face. He knew that the wing captain, whatever the wing captain did next, was not, in this morning, going to put a hook staff on Mireille's eye. That was enough. For the moment, that was enough. The long upper moor opened. The heather went on. Mira flew north. They flew for the first half of the morning into the long opening country. And Yusen watched the heather move under them and did not speak. And Mireille did not speak either. In the small ways an older one spoke, except for the slow, steady drum of the second heart and the long, careful wing beat. And the gray, cool, wet air went on. And somewhere, far behind them, an upper yard that had not, in 340 winters, seen its older one refuse a lift, was going about the slow, careful business of filing the morning. And Yusen did not let himself think about it. He thought, instead, about the high air, and the long wing beat, and the small, thin words he was going to use the next time Mireille turned her eye to him, to say what he had not yet said to her in the upper yard, around noon by his small belt glass, which was the small glass a handler child wore at his belt and read by the angle of the sun. Mireille's wing beat changed again. She tilted, slowly, in the cool, wet air, and dropped, careful, down toward a long, low stand of pines that ran along the eastern side of a small upper valley. And Yusen understood, in the small, slow handler way, that she was looking for water. He let her find it. He did not pull the small handler rein. He sat, small and quiet, in the lower saddle, and watched her come down into the upper valley, in the slow, long, careful glide she had used, all his life, to bring him down to a thing he had not yet earned the right to choose. She landed on the lower stones of a small stream that ran out of the upper pines. The water was clear and shallow. She lowered her long neck and drank, slowly, in the careful 3-swallow way the older ones drank. And Yusen unbuckled the lower strap and slid down the warm scale of her shoulder and stood, small and tired, on the lower stones. And he put his hand against the warm bone of her foreleg and rested his forehead against the warm scale. And for the first time since the wing captain had given the second order, he closed his eyes. He did not weep. He had not wept in 5 winters. He stood with his forehead against the warm bone, and he breathed, and he listened to the slow, long swallow of an old creature drinking from a small, clean stream. And he understood, in the small, slow way, that he was very tired, and very hungry, and very far from anything he had ever known, and that the only thing in the world that was still under his hand was the warm bone of a creature who, 2 hours ago, had closed her lower jaw around him to keep a hook staff off his eye. That was, just then, enough. After a long count, Mireille finished drinking. She lifted her long, warm neck and turned her eye, slow and yellow and very old. And she looked at him. The eye held him. The eye blinked. Once, very slow. The lower jaw warmed. The second heart, under the long, warm scale of the chest, drummed. In the small handler tongue, Yusin said, "Thank you." Mira's lower jaw warmed again. In the small, careful way, an older one returned a small word to a small, thin person. She lowered her long neck and laid the flat, warm bone of her lower jaw on the lower stones beside him, the way she had laid it 1,000 mornings in the lower stall when he was small, and she made the small, low, warm sound that was the sound she made when she was paying attention to a thing she did not want to lose. Yusin sat down on the lower stones beside the long, warm jaw and pressed his back into the warm bone, and the small stream ran around his small boots, and Mireille closed her eye, slowly, and let him rest against her, and the noon light came down clean and gray through the upper pines. And for a long, careful count, the upper valley held them, and the upper valley was quiet, and nothing in the upper valley moved, except the small, clean water, and the cool, wet wind, and the slow, steady drum of an old second heart. They did not stay long. Yusin knew, in the small handler way, that the small, clean water was a thing the second wing could track. He had grown up in the lower stalls of an upper wing, and he knew, with the slow, careful certainty an upper wing child knew, that a dragon who had drunk at a small, clean stream had left a long, warm trail on the lower air for at least a half-watch after, and the second wing, if a second wing had been sent, would not be a half-watch behind. He pushed up from the warm bone. He stood. He touched the warm scale of her shoulder. He said, in the handler tongue, "Lift." Mira lifted. The upper valley fell away under them. The heather opened ahead. The country opened. The lower farms gave way, very slowly, to the upper marshes. And the upper marshes gave way to a long stretch of broken stone country that Yusin had only ever seen on the small map in the wing house, and the broken stone country gave way, near the late afternoon, to a long, low line of green hills that he had never seen on any map at all. The green hills were a country the Halcyon service did not patrol. The green hills were a country the small map of the wing house did not show. The green hills were the upper edge of the country the wing house cook had spoken about, on the night he had been very drunk, when he had said that a handler child and an old dragon, if they flew north 4 days, would not in any practical sense be findable. It had been only 1 day. The green hills were here. Yusin, in the small lower saddle, did not understand. Mira, in the long, careful wing beat, did. She tilted, slow, in the cool air, and brought them down, careful, on the upper ridge of the first of the green hills, and Yusin, sliding down the warm scale of her shoulder onto the upper grass, saw, on the lower flank of the green hill, the small thing he had not been expecting to see. It was a small stone shrine. It was very old. It was set into the lower flank of the green hill, in the careful, small way the old binders had set their shrines, and it was no taller than Yusin's shoulder, and it was carved with the long, careful spiral that the old binders had used for the small private mark of a handler and dragon bond. And the small spiral, in the late afternoon light, was the same small spiral that Yusin had on the inner skin of his left wrist, where the bond mark had been laid the morning he had been given to Mireille, when he was 5 winters old. He stood on the upper grass for a long count and looked at the small stone shrine. Mira lowered her long neck and laid the flat, warm bone of her lower jaw on the upper grass beside the shrine. She did not make the warm, low sound. She did, instead, the small, careful thing the older ones did when they had brought a small, thin person to a place they had been waiting for a long count to bring them. She blinked, very slow, twice. She lowered her long, warm neck. She set the warm scale of her cheek gently against the small, old stone of the shrine. Yusin understood, in the small, slow way, that Mara had been here before. He sat down on the upper grass beside her. He looked at the small spiral. He looked at his wrist. He understood, in the slow, careful way, an understanding came to a 14-winter handler child, that the long telling of his bond with Mireille was a long telling that had begun, in some small private way, long before he had been laid in her stall at 5 winters old, and that the small stone shrine on the lower flank of the green hill was a thing that an older Mara, 2 or 3 or 4 small thin handler children ago, had been brought to by an older handler than he was, and that the long quiet telling of those older handlers was the telling that had taught Mira, when the order came, to know what to do. She had refused before. She had run before. She had brought a small, thin person, before, to the upper edge of the country the wing-house cook had spoken about. She had been, in the long telling of her 340 winters, more than just an older one of the Lenra wing. She had been, in the small, careful way, the older ones were the small, careful things they were, a keeper of a small, quiet road that the Halson service did not know about. The small road went north. The small road came, every 2 or 3 or 4 handler children, when a small, thin person and an old creature stood in an upper yard with a hookstaff between them and a strike order they could not lift. The small road did not, in the long, careful way of small roads, end in the lower marsh. Yusin pressed his hand against the warm scale of Mireille's cheek. He sat for a long count beside the small stone shrine. He did not weep. He had not wept in 5 winters. He did not weep now. He sat, instead, with the warm scale under his small thin hand and the small spiral of the shrine in front of him, and he listened to the long, slow drum of an old second heart, and he understood. In the slow, careful way, an understanding came to a small, thin, handler child on the upper grass of a green hill, that he was not, in any practical sense, the first handler child to whom the upper edge of the long north country had been a place to come. He was only the next one. That was, somehow, enough. They slept that night under the lower flank of the green hill, in the lee of the small stone shrine, with Mira curled around him in the slow, careful way, an old dam curled around a small kit, and the cool, wet wind moved through the upper grass, and the stars came out. And Yusin, who had not slept the night he had read the small book on the brass chain, slept that night, the slow, careful sleep of a small, thin person who had finally laid down a weight he had not, until that morning, known he had been carrying. In the upper yard of Lenra, by the second bell of the morning after, the filing was complete, and the high stallmaster had read it. And the high stallmaster had walked out, slowly, onto the upper yard, and had stood for a long count looking at the empty pad on which an older one had been standing the morning before. He was a hard man, the high stallmaster, and he had not, in 30 winters of stallmastering, lost an older one. He stood on the upper yard for a long count, and he did not, just then, say anything. He looked at the empty pad. He looked at the lower stair. He looked, last, at the small private place on the lower wall of the upper yard, where the small carved spirals of the older ones were kept. The one small spiral for each of the older ones the Lenra wing had carried in its long history. And he looked at the small spiral that was Mira's, which had been carved into the lower wall in the 7th winter of his grandfather's time. And he looked, beside it, at the small, fresh spiral that had been carved 2 winters ago, when Yusen had been given to her. He stood for a long count. Then, he turned. He walked down the lower stair, toward the wing house. He did not say anything. The wing captain, who had been waiting at the lower step with the filing in his hand, looked at the high stallmaster's face, and did not speak. "Wing Captain Vorinsar," the high stallmaster said, after a count. His voice was low. His voice was the voice of a hard man speaking in the small, careful way a hard man spoke when he had decided a thing he had not yet decided he had decided. "The lift. The lift, sir. The strike sites. The strike sites were correct, sir, by the data we had at the time. The column, the high stallmaster said, was a refugee line." The wing captain did not answer for a count. Then he said, quietly, The older one knew. Yes, sir. And the handler child. Yes, sir. The high stall master nodded, very slowly. He did not look at the wing captain. He looked at the empty pad. After a long count, he said, "We will not pursue. Sir, we will not pursue. The older one has gone. The handler has gone. They will not be returning to the Lenra wing." Well, the Lenra wing. We will not be returning to the Lenra wing. Sir, the procedure. The procedure, the high stall master said, is a procedure for a handler who has refused a lift the older one would have made. The older one would not have made this lift. The procedure does not, in any practical reading, apply. He turned his hard old eye to the wing captain, and the wing captain did not look away. But the wing captain understood. In the small, slow, careful way, an officer understood the moment an older officer was giving him a thing he had not earned, that he was being given something. The filing, the high stall master said. And one will read, "Older one and handler lost to the lower marsh, in good standing, in the service of the Halson, on the morning of the 3rd of Greenwater. The small spiral will be kept on the lower wall. The bond, in the small careful reading of the small book, will be honored as carried in full. Sir, Wing Captain Vorensar, sir, you will, in your remaining 7 winters of service, never again be given a lift order that does not first cross the desk of a stallmaster who has been told, in person, the names of the small lungs on the under air of the valley you are being sent to interdict. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir." "Good." The high stallmaster breathed out, once, slow. He looked at the empty pad. After a count, he said, very quietly, "I am sorry, old friend." He was not, in that sentence, speaking to the wing captain. The wing captain had the good sense not to answer. The high stallmaster stood for a long count more. Then he turned. He walked back down the lower stair. He did not, that morning, give any further orders. In the wing yard, that afternoon, the 7 other dragons of the Lenra wing were stood down for the day. In the small, careful way, an upper wing was stood down when one of its older ones was being honored. The pads were swept. The lower wall was washed. The small spiral that had been Mirez in the 7th winter of the high stall master's grandfather's grandfather was rubbed clean by the youngest handler child, a small, thin person named Esha Olari Tas, who was 12 winters old and who had been on the upper yard that morning and had seen, with her own small, thin eyes, the wing captain's hookstaff lowered and the older one's lower jaw open, and who had understood, in the small, slow handler way, more than the small book had ever told her she was allowed to understand. She rubbed the spiral clean. She set down her cloth. She stood, for a long count, in front of the small spiral, and she did the small, careful thing that handler children did in the lower wall of an upper yard when they were honoring an older one who had carried in full. She put her small, thin palm flat against the small spiral. She held her palm there for a slow count of 7. She lifted her palm. She turned. She walked, slowly, back across the upper yard, in the late afternoon light, toward the lower stair, on the upper edge of the green hill. 4 days' fly to the north of the upper yard of Lenra, a small, thin handler child and a 340 winter older one woke in the cool, wet morning, and the small, thin handler child opened his small, thin hand and looked at the small spiral on the inner skin of his left wrist. And he saw that the spiral, in the slow, careful way the old binder's marks did the small, careful things they did, had begun, very faintly, to warm. He did not know, in the moment, what the warming meant. He would learn, in the slow, careful way a small, thin handler child learned the small, careful things. That the warming was the small, private mark of a bond that had been kept in full, and that the warming would stay on his small, thin wrist, very faintly, for the rest of his life. And that it would be, in the long, quiet telling of his bond with Mire, the small private answer to the small private question every handler child, carried in the small, dark place behind the second of their three hearts, which was, did we do the right thing? The answer, on the upper edge of the green hill, in the slow, careful warmth of a small spiral on a small, thin wrist, was, yes, they lived, in the long, careful telling, for 41 years, on the upper edge of the long north country. They lived in the small, slow, careful way an old dragon and a small, thin person lived, in a country that the Halson service did not patrol, in the long, careful keeping of a small road that the old binders had laid for the small, thin handler children, who could not, in the small, careful place behind the second of their three hearts, carry the lifts they had been ordered to carry. They built, slowly, a small stone house, in the lee of the green hill. Yusen grew, in those 41 years, from a 14-winter handler child into a man, and then into an older man, and then, near the end, into an old man. And Mere, in the long, careful way of her people, slowed, very slowly, around him, the way an older one slowed around the small, thin person she had been given. The slow, careful country of the green hills came, in the long, quiet telling, to be the country of Yusen and Mere, the way some small, careful countries came, in the long, careful telling, to be the countries of the small, thin people, and the older ones who had carried them in full. Other handler children came. Over the years. A girl, in the 7th year, who had refused a lift in the eastern yard, and had been brought north by her own older one. A dark brown drake, named Tess. A boy, in the 11th, who had walked his older one out of the lower marsh on the morning his older one was to have been ringed. A pair of thin, small twins, in the 19th, whose older one, a small, slender flyer named Iraz, had carried them out of a lower yard on a coast Yusen had never heard of. Yusen received them all. He gave them, in the small, careful way the old binders had taught him to give, a place by the fire and a small stone of their own to carve the small spiral on. He taught them, in the small, careful way, the small handler tongue of the older ones, and the small, careful way of reading the under air of a valley for small lungs, and the small, careful way of standing, in an upper yard, with one's back to the lower jaw of one's older one, and one's small, thin hands flat against the warm scale. He taught them, also, the harder thing. He taught them that the refusing was not the brave part, and that the running was not the brave part, and that the carrying was not the brave part. The brave part, he told them, in the slow, careful way he had learned to tell them on the long evenings by the fire in the small stone house in the lee of the green hill, was the part that came after. The brave part was the long, careful keeping of the small road that began in the upper yard on the morning of the refusing, and that did not, in the long, careful way of small roads, end. The brave part was the small, thin person who, in his 40th winter, was still rubbing the cool, wet morning's frost off the small, carved spirals on the lower flank of the shrine. The brave part was the small, old hand on the warm bone of the older one who had slowed, very slowly, around him. The brave part was the small, thin person who did not, in the long, careful keeping of a bond carried in full, ever set the warm bone down. They listened. They did not always understand, in the first winter, what he was telling them. They understood it. Slowly. In the second winter, and the third, and the fourth, in the slow, careful way, an understanding came to a small, thin handler child, sitting by the fire, in the small stone house, with the warm scale of an older one curled around the lower wall of the room. Some of them did not stay. Some of them lifted, after a winter or two, and went on, into the further north, where there were other small old shrines, and other small careful roads, and other long careful keepings. Some of them stayed. The thin small twins of the 19th year stayed. They were, by the 40th, the keepers of the small stone house. In the long careful way the small thin people kept the small careful things they were given. He did not in those 41 years weep. He had not wept in 5 winters before the morning on the upper yard. And he did not weep in the years after. And he did not weep on the morning of the 40th year, when he stood on the upper edge of the green hill and watched Mira lay her long, warm neck for the last time on the lower stones beside the small stream where she had drunk on their first day. And he did not weep when her second heart, after a long, careful count, stopped drumming under his old hand. He sat, instead, with his palm flat on the warm bone of her foreleg for a long count in the cool, wet morning. And he said, in the small handler tongue, the small word he had said to her, in the upper yard, on the morning of the 3rd of Greenwater, 41 winters before. Thank you, he said. Old friend. Thank you for not lifting. He sat for a long count with his palm on the warm bone, and the cool, wet wind moved through his old hair, and the small, clean water of the stream ran around his old boots, and the cool gray morning held them, and the small old man and the small old dragon. In the long, careful way the small old country held its small old things, were quiet, and the long, careful keeping of the small road went on. He lived another 2 winters. He died. In the slow, careful way an old man died, who had lived a long, careful life, in the small stone house in the lee of the green hill, with the thin, small twins of the 19th year by then, themselves an older man and woman, with handler children of their own sitting at his bedside in the careful order they had been sitting in, beside him, for 22 years. He did, near the very end, lift his small old hand and turn it, and look at the inner skin of his left wrist, where the small spiral of the bond mark had been laid on the morning he was 5 winters old, and where the small spiral, in the slow, careful warmth of the bond, kept in full, had warmed for 43 winters since the morning on the upper yard of Lenra. The small spiral, on the last morning, was warm. He looked at it. He smiled. He laid his small old hand down. He breathed out, once, slow. He did not breathe in again. They buried him on the upper edge of the green hill, beside the small old shrine of the binders. In the small, careful way the small, thin people of the upper country buried their own. They carved, on the lower flank of the shrine, beside the small old spiral that had been carved there in the long, careful time before any of them had been alive, the small new spiral of the small, thin person who had brought Mira north on the morning of the 3rd of Greenwater. The small new spiral was small. The small new spiral was, in the long, careful way of the binder's marks, the equal of the small, old one. It is there still. The green hills do not, in the long, careful way of the small, old country, give up their dead easily, and the small stone shrine is in good repair. And the small spirals on the lower flank are, in the long, careful keeping of the small, thin people who still come, in 2, or 3, or 4, small, careful handler children, very faintly warm to the touch. The small, thin people who come do not, in the long, careful way, speak the name of the wing captain who gave the lift, or of the high stallmaster who, on the lower stair of the wing house, did not pursue, or of the old cook who, in his cups, told a 14-winter handler child about the country 4 days north of the upper moor. They speak, instead, of the small, thin handler child who refused a lift, and of the old dragon who refused beside him, and of the small, careful road that began in the upper yard of Lenra on the morning of the 3rd of Greenwater. And that did not, in the long, careful way of small, careful roads, end. On the upper edge of the green hill, on the lee of the small old shrine, in the cool, wet morning, the small new spiral is, very faintly, warm. The keeping is full. The small, thin people of the long north country come, sometimes, in 2s and 3s, to the upper edge of the green hill. In the slow, careful way, a small, thin person comes to a place that has been waiting for them. They lay their small, thin palms on the small new spiral. They hold their palms there for a slow count of 7. They lift their palms. They turn. They walk, slowly, back down the lower flank of the green hill, in the cool, wet morning, with the small, careful warmth of the keeping on the inner skin of their palms, and the long, careful road of the small old binders goes on under them. And the green hills hold the small old shrine, and the small old shrine holds the small spirals, and the small spirals hold, in the long, careful way, the small, thin handler children and the older ones who carried them in full. And the cool, wet wind moves through the upper grass, and the country, in the long, careful way of small, careful countries, is quiet. And the keeping, in the long, careful way of small, careful keepings, is enough.